Okay, welcome to another episode of Thoughts and Bolts. I'm your host, Pedro Laveria, and you can see the title of today's show behind me. But what it really should be titled is Keep the Book of Enoch Away from the UFO topic. Okay, the Book of Enoch, okay, the story it tells, okay, if applied to the UFO topic, is a terrible story. It's a horrible story. And I say this from kind of an ethical perspective, right? And when I say ethics, I mean ethos, right? The values and vision of a group of people. So, with regards to the values and vision we should have vis a vis the UFO topic, I think the Book of Enoch is more harmful than beneficial. And I think the Eddas and Aeschylus, and to a lesser extent Hesiod, vis-a-vis the story of Prometheus, gives us a much more positive um, vision to have vis-a-vis this topic. And I'll tell you why. That's what this is all about. Okay. First of all, let's start with what I call the UFO to consciousness pipeline, right? Anybody that studies UFOs long enough will eventually run into parapsychology. Okay, and it's inescapable. Okay, so you may start off reading about the tic tac and how fast it went, or different cases where there was a landing and what that did to the ground. But eventually, if you keep getting into the subject, and you keep going down the rabbit hole, you're gonna come to the close encounter phenomenon, and with that, attendant psi. Okay, so we're talking about telepathy, telekinesis, clairvoyance, that sort of thing. And so this is the UFO to consciousness pipeline. Okay, the ufology to parapsychology pipeline. Ufology and parapsychology are two sides of the same coin. They're inseparable. Okay, and the sooner you accept that, the better. Now, keep a pin in that because it's important to what we're going to talk about. Okay, vis-a-vis the Book of Enoch and all that. Now, one more thing about this. Okay. Parapsychology, what we call, telepathy, telekinesis, clairvoyance, and all that, there is a word for it that's older than parapsychology, and it's magic. Okay. That's what people always referred to as magic, at least in the West, was what we now call telekinesis, telepathy, clairvoyance, right? Um, and that gets uncomfortable for a lot of people, but that's what it is, right? East of Greece in the Buddhist tradition and Hindu tradition, they were called the siddhis, right? Abilities people gained after meditating years and years and years for hours and hours a day on end. Um, and so, keep a pin in that too. Okay, so you have the UFO to consciousness pipeline, right? The ufology to parapsychology pipeline, but also keep in mind that what parapsychology studies is what in the Middle Ages and in antiquity people called magic. Okay. So this is Jeremy Corbell, Dr. Jim Lakatsky, and Dr. Colin Kelleher. Okay. Jim Lakatsky ran OSAP. OSAP was the largest government UFO program that's officially recognized in public. Okay. And Colin Kelleher was the operations manager. And again, OSAP was a classified DIA, that is Defense Intelligence Agency, Pentagon UFO program, the largest that is publicly acknowledged to exist. And, it got outed in 2017 and all that good stuff. But keep, keep what I just said in mind when listening to Dr. Lakatsky vis-a-vis human abilities, latent, dormant human ability. Okay, because it's important once we get into Enoch, Prometheus, and the Eddas. Okay.
We're on the trail of reverse engineering, crash saucer, metamaterials, weird stuff. You went knocking at different places, and the door was slammed in your face. That sounds like you were looking for exactly what we're talking about right here. Is that wrong?
Of course not. That was part of the program. But I'm saying the door being slammed in our face wasn't because of suspected demonic activities within this at all. In fact, I would say there's evidence that this is something of a nature that, well, I better not say much more. It's if full human capabilities were known to us right now, it is not such something that we need to fear. And I do not, I just don't believe it. Maybe I'm influenced by my Catholic faith. I don't know, but I'm optimistic. I think everything heads toward good.
What do you mean by if full human capabilities were understood, it would be
we
nothing
don't
to fear?
use any. We'll get into that later at some later point. But our capabilities, as Colin well knows, he's probably an expert in all of these areas, more so than me. Is our capabilities are have never been fully revealed, and we're still learning. We've got a long way to evolve still.
Okay, full human abilities. Okay. If you look at you know, everything we know about remote viewing and the fact that uh WhatsApp was using at least one remote viewer, Joe McMoneagle, to do their work. We're talking about parapsychology here, okay? And what he just said dovetails with what a witness to the Virginia crash says as well. So this is a great book by the late great Dr. Roger Lear, the first investigation of the Virginia crash in Brazil, which is called the Brazilian Roswell. Um, Basically, there's a doctor who, there was a creature that was captured, and that creature was taken to his hospital, and he had to treat it, and it died. But supposedly, this doctor claims that there was a telepathic communication with the being. And what did the being talk to him about? Human potential, right? Um, I recommend the Virginia documentary by James Fox. But yeah, so this message about human potential, uh, specifically parapsychological potential, whether that be telepathy, telekinesis, clairvoyance, and how it's untapped, it's a theme that runs through not just the close encounter phenomenon, but what we just listened to from Dr. Jim Lakatsky. Um, Now, this is important because now we're going into the meat of this show, which is my critique of the Book of Enoch and why I think Prometheus myth and a very specific myth about Odin in the Eddas is far more productive. Because look, I get it. The Book of Enoch, it has this pedigree, right? It was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Um, the Book of Jude in the New Testament quotes from it. Um, it's in the it's in the canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So if that kind of thing is important to you, then hey, this is like a good way to, well, some people would think is using the Book of Enoch, First Enoch, is a good way of kind of porting what we learn about the UFO subject into kind of a Christian worldview, right? But I don't think it is. I don't think it is. And here's why. Let's get into not the whole Book of Enoch, but the part that people are most concerned about vis-a-vis the UFO phenomenon, right? So in chapter 6, you start with this conspiracy, right, where these angels say, "Hey, the women in Earth, those Earth women, those mortal women, they're very beautiful. Let's go down and have some fun with them. But we got to make a pact not to rat each other out because the Most High isn't very fond of this kind of thing." Um, this story in Enoch is really just an expansion of the story in Genesis, right? Where the sons of God were actually in Hebrew the Bnei Elohim, which probably most accurately should be translated as the gods, right? Because Bnei isn't doesn't just mean sons; it means members of this of a like a guild or a tribe. Um, and Elohim, the gods. So it's literally Bnei Elohim is literally the gods, right? Because the ancient Israelites, specifically the Yahwist, right? The J source, uh, had a view of God sitting in a kind of a divine council, like the Olympian gods on Mount Olympus. And so you had these gods, these lower gods. But we'll just say the angels for the sake of first Enoch, because that's what we're talking about. The angels, they come down, they copulate with they get married, they have sex, whatever, with the women of men, and they have children with them, right? And these are the names of the angels. They go down. There's a bunch of them, and they do what they do. So they get with the women of mankind, and from them is birth like this half-breed race called the Nephilim, right? The fallen, right? These giants, right? These supermen, literally, right? But it's not just that, right? These angels teach humanity sorcery, charms. They teach them how to use roots and plants. So they teach them medicine, okay? And this is all portrayed as being very negative, right? This is the theft of fire myth that we see in a bunch of different cultures. And in this Hebrew version, this Jewish version, right, dating from like 300 BC, it's all portrayed as very negative, right? Because if you look at Genesis, right, starting from chapter 2 on, which is comes from the J source, um, the God of the Old Testament is depicted as being obsessed with boundary maintenance, right? So the Adam and the Eve, they can eat from the true tree of life, or they can eat from the tree of knowledge, but they can't eat from both, right? But God tells them, hey, don't eat from the tree of knowledge, right? You can eat from any tree, but you can't eat from the tree of knowledge, which implies they can eat from the tree of life, right? So they eat from the tree of knowledge, and what do they say? Oh, the man has become like one of us, knowing good from evil. So then they can't eat from the tree of life, right? The sacred distance has been collapsed, right? The man has become like one of us, meaning the gods, knowing good from evil. So the sacred distance has been collapsed. And what's the penalty? He gets kicked out of the garden, right? And he has no more access to the tree of life, which means he's going to die. Okay. So essentially, it's like a delayed death penalty. And then you see in the Babylon myth, right, where again, what are the humans going to do? They're going to collapse the sacred distance, right? They're going to bridge that gap, literally physically, by building a tower to go into heaven, right? And again, that can't happen. So the humans, their language gets, muddled up, so they can't communicate, and so they can't work together to build a tower, right? And this is the same thing here, right? This this distance between the spiritual and the physical in the case of the first book of Enoch, the heavenly and the mundane has been bridged, right, in the form of these Nephilim, these half breeds, um, and also the knowledge of heaven, right, in terms of sorcery and charms and medicine has been given to humanity, and this is depicted as like this totally chaotic, horrible thing. Um, and some of the other angels not only teach magic and medicine, but they also taught how to make weapons, right? Swords of iron, shields and breastplates on every instrument of war, eye paint and precious stones and dyes, metalwork, jewelry, artisanship, right? Arts and crafts essentially is what they gave the human beings, right? They taught them astronomy, or what probably more accurately astrology, right? So they taught them essentially what could be called science as it existed back then, right? And so again, this is a theft of fire myth, right? That we'll see later with Prometheus. But here in Enoch, it's depicted as this horrible thing that shouldn't have happened, right? Not only did you mix the heavenly and mundane race, right, and collapse the sacred distance there, but you also got the knowledge of heaven, the arts of heaven, the technology of heaven, the technique of heaven, the techne of heaven, right? And then you brought it down to earth, and now it's created havoc, right? So now men have access to not just magic, but they also have access to metallurgy, they can become artisans, and they also have access to medicine and astrology and all that sort of thing. And this is all depicted as being very bad. Um, and then, the what happens? The angels rat out these fallen angels to God, right? Um, and God says, "Hey, you have to destroy the bastards, destroy the half breeds, destroy the sons of misintegration," right? Um, and so basically, there needs to be a genocide, right, of these supermen, right, that were created by collapsing the sacred distance. Okay. And what's even worse is that these fallen angels, okay, who not only created the race of supermen by having sex with the sons of men, and not only that, these fallen angels that had given mankind uh, technique and technology, right? Whether that be magic or metallurgy, whether that be medicine or, uh, craft of any kind, they were cowardly, right? So they wanted to get back into the graces of the Almighty. Um, and they told Enoch, like, please, please go talk to God and like, please petition that him to forgive us so that we can go back to heaven. Okay. Now, keep that in mind, right? Because, how do we deal with the human potential Lukatsky alluded to, and which is explicitly described in that account from Virginia, right? If we're using Enoch, first Enoch, as our template for understanding the UFO phenomenon, we would have to say that anything psi related is bad, right? If first Enoch is your template, right, for understanding the UFO phenomenon, you would have to reject psychic phenomenon, the actual cultivation and learning of such technique, as bad and against the will of the creator. And you would have to view the spectral revolution that we've talked about before, a coming day in the future where people, academia, the mainstream, acknowledges these things for the realities they are, and the disruption and the changes that will inevitably come from that. You would also have to view that as being bad as well, right? And so you would have to look at the UFO phenomenon, and disclosure is bad too, because nothing will catalyze the spectral revolution. Nothing will further the final acknowledgement of parapsychology by the scientific mainstream than the reality of UFOs. Because again, they're two sides of the same coin. So if you're going to use first Enoch as your template, you need to reject disclosure, right? Because that is a form of collapsing the sacred distance between the celestial and the mundane. So you have to be anti UFO, anti the disclosure of UFOs, and you have to be anti any kind of technology or technique that's derived from the UFO phenomenon vis-a-vis crash retrievals or vis-a-vis any communication had with a non-human intelligence, right? You have to be against all of those if you take first Enoch as your template for understanding the UFO phenomenon. Why? Because first Enoch looks upon those things as bad. You cannot collapse the sacred distance between the celestial and the mundane, and you cannot take the technique and technology of the celestial for the benefit of the mundane, that is humanity. Okay, that is essentially the message of first Enoch, right? So, and that's why I think this is a horrible, horrible myth for understanding the UFO phenomenon, and for guiding us in navigating disclosure and the implications of disclosure. Okay, so that's why I don't like the Book of Enoch. But let's be positive and talk about what I do like and what I do think is positive and can serve as a better guiding light. Okay, now Prometheus Bound, to play by Aeschylus. Okay. And we're not going to go over the whole play, but we're going to go over just kind of the bare bones. Okay. So Prometheus is condemned by Zeus to be chained to a rock on the Caucasus. Okay. Why? Because Prometheus stole the fire from Mount Olympus and gave it to the human beings. But he didn't just give the human beings fire. Okay. The play starts with describing the situation, right? He stole fire from Mount Olympus, gave it to the human beings. So Zeus punishes him by, you know, uh, you know, chaining him, having two of the gods chain him to a rock in the Caucasus, right? Um, and this is his lament, as you can read on the screen, right? Um, and one of the things Prometheus talks about is the fact that you know he didn't just give fire, but he gave humanity technology, right? He gave humanity uh, the the knowledge of taming horses and in the wheel and the carts and chariots that come with that. Um, human beings were kind of dumb and didn't know anything, but he taught them about how the interpretation of dreams, and he essentially woke them up, right? He could be rightly described as kind of like the Titan of consciousness, right? He woke up humanity, but that's not all, right? He taught them how to make medicine, right? Um, and just like the Watchers did in the first Enoch, and he taught them magic. He taught them divination, right? Um, just like the Watchers did in first Enoch, and he taught them metallurgy and craft, just like the Watchers did in first Enoch. Yea, all manner of arts men from Prometheus learned, right? So in Aeschylus, right, we have this tragedy, right? A hero, okay, a hero. Prometheus in this play is a hero, whereas in First Enoch, the fallen angels are villains. But in Prometheus Bound, he is a tragic hero, okay? And rather than beg for forgiveness, rather than have the Watchers tell Enoch, "We'll talk to the Almighty, have him forgive us, see if we can get back in his good graces." No, 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 no. Prometheus, he says, you know, I hate all the gods. I hate all the gods because having received good at at my hands, they have rewarded me with evil, proved me proves me stark mad. Right? Because Hermes says, "You're crazy. Just try to like say you're sorry. Maybe Zeus will forgive you." And he says, "I hate all the gods." And Hermes says, "That just proves you're crazy." He's like, crazy as you please if hating your enemies is crazy, right? Madness as you please if hating your enemies is madness, right? So, he's unrepentant. Prometheus found human beings in this horrible condition. He gave them fire. He gave them magic. He gave them the arts. He gave them, all kinds of medicine and know-how. He gave them technology and techne, and because of that, he was punished. But he was unrepentant, right? Because he knew he had done the right thing, and to hell with Zeus, right? This is the exact opposite of what's described in the first book of Enoch, right? And I think this is, again, proves to be a far better myth uh, as it pertains to providing us an ethos to understand the UFO phenomenon, right? We should never ever be tempted to look at the pilots of the UFOs as gods. We should never be tempted to look at the pilots of the UFOs as angels, as something more evolved than us, higher than us, right? If you do think that way, you probably feel the same way about uncontacted Amazonian Indians. And if so, shame on you, right? Because you're no better than those uncontacted Amazonian Indians. You're just lucky enough to live in a culture with the technology and technique that you do. But you're not better than them. You're not superior to them. As a matter of fact, if you got thrown in the Amazon, you would die within 48 hours. Whereas that Amazonian Indian, you put him in the Amazon, all he sees is, a supermarket, right? He's ready to survive and he's going to make it. You're not. Okay. So, this is the attitude we need to have with the UFO phenomenon. Whoever is behind the machines, okay, they're not better than us. And, you know, to hell with them for not helping us out in our time of need by giving us the technique and technology that we need. Okay. And if we can steal some of that, if we can glean some of that from crash retrievals or from the close encounter phenomenon, if we can learn things from that and gain ideas, then that's the theft of fire and all the better for us, right? And the same thing goes for, the legacy program. We should not be in awe of these people, right? If anything, we should have some degree of enmity towards them, right? Because they're holding us back. They're not doing what Prometheus did, right? So I think that, this myth is very pro-human and it's very progressive vis-a-vis parapsychology, vis-a-vis the spectral, which is what we need to have, okay, in order to, be more on par with whoever's flying around in our skies, uh, unannounced. Now, let's go to the poetic Edda, right, and the story of Odin, the one-eyed. Now, this is a great story, and I'm a little perplexed. I think in my own personal leisure time, I'm gonna dig deeper into this for myself, and you'll see why. So basically, what happens is Odin, he recounts this episode of his life, right? Odin is the chief god, right? And what he does is kind of he hangs himself from a tree with a spear piercing his side, right? And in his moment of agony, he pulls out these runes, right? And then he makes contact with one of his ancestors. Now, if you read the Poetic Edda, it's not very clear, because we don't have the larger cultural context, right? Like we're not Vikings, okay? And the pre-Christian Vikings didn't really, the Norsemen didn't write a lot down, if anything, right? So what we're left with is these poems that were finally written down in the Christian era of their culture, right? Um, and so there's a lot of context missing. When I read this story, I wonder if this is kind of describing some form of divination practice, perhaps some kind of shaman in that culture would maybe asphyxiate themselves and practice some form of bloodletting so as to induce this kind of mental state of shock and euphoria so as to have kind of like this parapsychological effect so that they could, download information. I don't know. That would make sense, but I don't know if that's the case. But anyways, Odin he hangs himself from a tree, and he pierces his side with his own spear, and he hangs there for days, and he doesn't eat. But again, at the extreme of his pain, he pulls out the runes and he makes contact with one of his ancestors, and one of his ancestors was a giant. So it seems like he went into kind of the realm of the dead, right? He didn't die because the Norse gods can die. So if he had died there, it would have been over. But he kind of went into the land of the dead, it appears, and communicated with one of his ancestors and got hidden knowledge. And what he got was essentially spells, right? And he spells out the 18 different spells he learned from his ancestor, okay, through this painful experience. Okay. The 18th, he doesn't share secret. Okay. Now, I think this story should be part of the theft of fire collection, right? So the theft of fire myth, it appears in a million different cultures, right? But I think this should be added to the canon. Okay. First of all, it's kind of an inversion of the Promethean myth, right? So in the Promethean myth, the elder god Zeus, right, punishes Prometheus by having him, chained to a rock, right, and a liver, a hawk pulling out his liver every day. Whereas in this case, Odin, the head god himself, hangs himself from a tree, right? And pierces his own side with a spear. So it's like an inversion of the Prometheus story, okay? And then um he gains this magical knowledge from presumably the realm of the dead or from his ancestor, and which would make sense that his ancestor's dead. Otherwise, why would he do this? He would just visit him, right? So he goes into realm of the dead. He gets this magical knowledge, and then he shares it with humanity, right? So it's like a theft of fire, right? It is not the theft of fire, but the taking of fire, the taking of magic, right? And he gives it to humanity. He teaches the spells to humanity, right? So Odin gives humanity magic, right, and medicine, all right? And so again, I think this is a far more positive myth, right? Um, rather than having the head god trying to keep this sacred distance intact, right? Rather than being obsessed with boundary maintenance, right? The head god, collapses the sacred boundary, right? By sharing his power with humanity, right? By teaching them magic, right? And he suffers on behalf of humanity in order to gain that, rather than torturing the person who gave the knowledge to humanity, right? Um, and so this is a far more positive um, myth than the one in First Enoch, right? Because it speaks to the fact that the spectral, right, belongs to us, right? It belongs to us, right? That the head god, the creator, wants us to have it. Okay. Um, and the same thing with the Prometheus myth. Remember, in the Greek mythology, Prometheus created mankind. Zeus did not create mankind, Prometheus created mankind. So the creator God, again, wants humanity to embrace the spectral, right? To have it, to have the spectrum and the specter, the magic and the realm of possibility that exists between two binaries, right? Whereas the God in First Enoch doesn't want that, right? The God in First Enoch creates through uh, bifurcation of opposites, right? He creates by creating opposite poles, right? Light and darkness, heaven and earth, human and divine, right? And there's no room for the spectral in there, right? Let alone magic, which is the other half of the spectral, right? The specter, right? Um, but that's not the case with the Greek myth, and it's not the case with the Norse myth, right? In the Greek and the Norse myth, the spectral is what we're encouraged to pursue, and I'll tell you why. Okay. If you look at the Genesis story, right, and there's a version of it in First Enoch. Okay, so after the god destroys the earth, what does he do? He destroys all the humans, right, and all the animals except for two of each, and Noah's family. But at the end, what does he do? He puts in the sky his bow, right? And if you look at the Hebrew, I mean, the word bow is literally like bow, as in bow and arrow. Okay, so the spectral is his tool to use, not our tool, his tool. The spectral belongs only to him. Why? Again, he's obsessed with boundary maintenance, right? And the spectral is all about bridging those boundaries, right? The spectrum bridges the boundary between two opposite poles, right? The spectral, vis-a-vis, parapsychology, magic, whatever, uh, bridges the boundaries um, between distance and time and all that kind of thing, between my individuality and your individuality, vis-a-vis telepathy and all that sort of thing, right? So the Hebrew telling of the theft of fire story, it's very apparent that the spectral, okay, belongs to the creator and no one else, right? Human beings aren't supposed to have it, okay? And that's why what the angels did was so bad. But if you look in the Norse mythology, right, what is the bridge from Midgard, where we live, and Asgard, where the gods live? It's the Bifrost. It's literally the Rainbow Bridge, right? Because the spectral aspect, in this case, literally a spectrum, bridges the sacred distance between the human and the divine, right? And the same thing goes with parapsychology and all those abilities studied in parapsychology. They are they are abilities that people generally attribute in our culture with non-human, right? But the human can do it too. Okay, and that bridges and that's literally a spectrum, right? That's literally the spectral that bridges the gap between the human and the non-human, right? That blurs those distinctions, right, between human and non-human, right? Is are those parapsychological abilities. So in the Norse mythology, the spectral is not something that only belongs to the head god. No, 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 no. It's the thing that bridges the gap between the human and the divine, and the heroes, right? The heroes, when they go to Asgard, they have to go up through the Bifrost, right? And again in Prometheus, right? Not Prometheus bound the play by Aeschylus, but if you read Hesiod, the Theogony, right? Um, who saves Prometheus from, you know, being changed to the mountain? It's Hercules. Hercules, a spectral being, right? Because Hercules has a mortal mother and an immortal father, right? His mother was a mortal woman, and his father is Zeus, the king of the gods. So he is a specter. He is a spectral being, right? His own existence collapses that sacred distance, right? He is what the Hebrews would call a Nephilim, right? And he is the one that unbinds Prometheus, the god, the titan of technology, the titan of technique, the titan of technoscience, right? So Prometheus is unbound by the spectral being, right? In this case, Hercules, right? So I mean, this is awesome, right? This is a much better, a much better mythos from which we can derive an ethos vis-a-vis the UFO phenomenon and its attendant parapsychology. Okay, and that's all I really want to say about this, right? Um, the Book of Enoch, First Enoch. Hey, if you want to use it for liturgical purposes, right? If this is part of the liturgy in your church, right? If you want to use it for devotional purposes, as you do your religious thing, hey, that's none of my business. To each his own, right? But when it comes to the UFO phenomenon, right? This is the worst story that we could possibly leverage in order to come to grips with the UFO phenomenon and its attendant parapsychological realities. Okay. A far better myth is that of Prometheus. And another really good myth is that of Odin in the Poetic Edda, right? The Greek and the Norse, right? Coming together really provide us with a much better way of approaching this. If we use First Enoch, like I said, um, with that, like I alluded to earlier, we really denigrate ourselves, right? And it really invites us to take a stance more akin to that of the Collins elite, right? Because it was the fallen angels that taught the human beings about magic. It was the fallen angels that bridged the gap between the human and the divine, right? Um, and they were cowards, right, at the end and repentant. But you know, in Aeschylus, the creator of mankind wanted that sacred distance to be collapsed. The creator of mankind wanted us to have the technique and the technology of the gods, right? And the same is true with the poetic Edda vis-a-vis Odin. So I think that if you want to leverage ancient myth so as to create an ethos that will allow us to uh, wrestle with the UFO reality. And again, it's attendant psychological, the parapsychological um, realities, right? Um, Prometheus and Odin are far better templates than the book of First Enoch. The first book of First Enoch, I believe, if taken to its logical extreme, is detrimental. Okay, it is not something that's going to help us. It's going to hold us back and harm us in the long run. Okay, so with that, I just want to say your consciousness is not classified. Learn to meditate, get a book on remote viewing, do whatever it takes to play with your consciousness, explore your consciousness, um, expand your consciousness. This as long as you don't hurt yourself, others, or break the law. With that, I bid you good night.